It's pretty much impossible to talk about the transition between original and modern Dragon Ball without talking about God Ki. And because a lot of the decisions that were made in Battle of Gods ended up becoming the foundation for a lot of the material we would get past that point, of course a concept as central to that movie as God Ki would be under a lot of scrutiny. And honestly, when I use the phrase modern Dragon Ball, I'm actually using it pretty loosely. As crazy as it is to say, Battle of Gods came out almost 13 years ago, which of course has given the community plenty of time to circulate the common observations and criticisms about this concept. And just to set the tone for the video, I agree with the majority of these criticisms. I think it's relatively limited as a power system. I think it creates a few opportunities for inconsistencies that we'll cover today. And I think that you can pretty much remove it from the story and not much really changes, which is probably the worst thing you can say about a concept in a story. And I really hate to say all of that about a concept as important as God Ki needed to be. Toriyama can be quoted to have wanted to end Dragon Ball as early as the Cell Saga, so for him to come back and start reintroducing ideas for the manga, there needed to be a compelling reason for the story to continue. There needed to be a hard reset. So for the community to pretty much unanimously agree that God Ki did fall short to some extent isn't really a great sign for Super Story, because of course God Ki is a big part of its foundation. But I don't think that this idea is completely unsalvageable. If you're a fan of Dragon Ball, you've heard the phrase good concept with bad execution all the time. So today, I'm going to be throwing my hat in the ring, offering some critiques of God Ki, its introduction, its utilization within the story, and hopefully tweaking a few things here and there to make the concept into something that I think works a little bit better for the story that Super's trying to tell. So first I want to open up a discussion centered around probably the most important piece of context behind God Ki, and that's that when Battle of Gods was being worked on, Dragon Ball Super obviously didn't exist. It was only after the success of this movie that plans for a new series materialized, which is why Battle of Gods is a Dragon Ball Z movie instead of a Dragon Ball Super movie. Super didn't exist. So with that in mind, we need to look at God Ki as a concept that was originally only supposed to exist within the context of a movie, which of course has limited runtime. So what exactly was God Ki during Battle of Gods, the movie? Well, to put it the most simply, it was a new power that Goku needed if he was to have any hope of fighting Beerus on even footing. And as we break this idea down, it'll become clear how it was able to propel the plot of the movie and serve as a hard reset for the series that would follow. So let's start with Beerus. The most important thing about Beerus, other than his being much stronger than Goku, is the fact that he's a god of destruction. I have an entire video on the channel breaking down the concept of godhood in Dragon Ball and its development over the course of the original manga, so if you're wanting a deeper dive on that idea, definitely go check that video out. But all I'll say here is that Beerus being a new type of god slots pretty well into Dragon Ball's story because Toriyama was in the habit of introducing new gods just about every arc, especially in the post-time skip of the manga. So let's talk about Goku next. Of course, him being the type of character he is, a situation where there's a new strong opponent to fight is right up his alley. One of Goku's primary motivations was always the pursuit of strength, and he's always enjoyed fighting against a strong opponent, so he fits in here pretty well. And his opponent specifically being a god serves as a nice change of pace from what we had been seeing in the manga up to this point. A god hadn't been specifically threatening to Goku since Kami in original Dragon Ball. King Kai wasn't really a combatant whenever we saw him, and of course, Shin was made to be not really impressive to lull our heroes into a false sense of security during the Buu Saga, so Beerus being a threatening person in terms of combat is really a nice shift from what we had been seeing before. And to top all that off, it's pretty fitting that God Ki ended up being the hard reboot for the series right after Goku had received the life of a god, Elder Kyle Shen's, during the Buu Saga. So all of these factors end up combining into a situation that's okay at the absolute worst and great at best. Obviously Beerus and by extension Whis are some of the best characters to be introduced in modern Dragon Ball period, and they're great throughout this entire movie. The plot is also good in the mechanical sense. The ritual that's needed for Goku to become the Super Saiyan God ends up revealing Vidal's pregnancy, which is a really cool callback to the flash forward that we get at the end of Z. And to top it all off, Goku, the main character, gets a really cool character conflict in this story that is really underrated in my opinion, in that he's dissatisfied that he achieved this power through a ritual and a wish on the Dragon Balls. And he knows that the gap between where he is now as the Super Saiyan God and where he was before was a gap that he was probably never going to be able to close on his own. So in reality, it's no wonder that a concept like this that had such great synergy with the original manga, while also introducing fresh concepts to the story, ended up making a movie that was as good as Battle of Gods was. But flash forward to the present and we all look at God Key as something that fell short, so the obvious question is what happened? Well, if you ask me, the issues that start to show up whenever God Key is removed from the context of Battle of Gods and instead made the foundation for an entirely new series have their roots in that foundational sentence that I was talking about earlier. At its core, God Key was a power that Goku needed in order to have any hope of being able to fight on even footing with Beerus. And interestingly enough, a lot of the common issues that people have with God Key are related to that sentence. Take for example the Beerus moving goalpost problem, or the fact that this really great character conflict that's present for Goku in Battle of Gods isn't really present in Super for some reasons that we'll talk about later. Or maybe most importantly, take for example that the power gap that was created by God Key in the first place is presented pretty inconsistently in Super as something that is insurmountable in certain situations, or completely not a problem for other characters as long as there's a reason for them to have reached that level of strength. And to top all that off, because God Key was introduced in Battle of Gods as something that was pretty bare bones in the power system sense, with only a few characteristics that really made it different from regular Key, the longer that Super went on, a lot of the best that we were able to see in terms of the exploration of this power system were things that were essentially rehashes of things that had already happened in the original manga. Things like Mastered Super Saiyan Blue, which is pretty similar to Mastered Super Saiyan. Now, of course there are exceptions to this rule, but it is an interesting thing to point out. So with all that in mind, I think that a lot of the common critiques can really be summed up in this specific symptom that needs to be touched on before we move on to solutions to these problems. And that's the difference between how ideas were handled in the original Dragon Ball versus how they're handled in Super. Now I do want to clarify, of course, there's no problem in these two different manga being different, obviously, but this is an important parallel to draw just so we can understand what's going on here. So the first thing that we need to understand is that God Key was not introduced in a vacuum. Aside from all the new characters like Beerus and Whis that had God Key, there was also the idea of the multiverse that was introduced in this exact same movie. And multiple ideas with a lot of potential being introduced around the same time is not new to Dragon Ball at all. Of course, there's the stretch between the 23rd World Martial Arts Tournament and the Saiyan Saga, where a lot of new things like the concept of the Namekians and the Saiyans and the new planets and Frieza were all being introduced around the same time. But the difference in how things were handled back then is that one of Toriyama's superpowers as a writer and concepts was always his vagueness. He would always leave his new ideas that he introduced a little bit open-ended so he could return to them later and explore them as little or as much as he wanted to. This is all over original Dragon Ball. So what if I told you that this idea of God Key being a pretty solid concept in Battle of Gods and really only becoming weaker when it was stretched out over the course of an entire series actually wasn't the entire picture? What if it was an idea that was flawed from the start? So let's return then to the events of Battle of Gods. We already know that even after Goku goes through the ritual and becomes the Super Saiyan God, it's nowhere near enough to actually defeat Beerus. And of course Beerus ends up sparing him and the Earth and saying that we can just have a rematch later. So if we already know that Goku has a long way to go before he can reach Beerus, why would it make sense for him to keep what he gained from the ritual when the story already spent all this time establishing that Goku had a problem with getting to this point off borrowed power? Keeping God Key temporary for Goku preserves a very interesting character conflict that we saw for him during this movie that we just hadn't seen for the character before. Although it was very cool and impressive to see him acclimate to this level and stay there after losing the form, the fact of the matter is that when God Key becomes something permanent for Goku, it solves a problem that would have been very interesting for us to see him work through on his own. By keeping this level of power as something that he has to now work through in this entirely new series, now Goku reaching Beerus' level is a lot more personal than just protecting the Earth. Now it's Goku proving to himself that he can reach these levels of power, this time without the help. Now this change might seem like a small one at first, so I do want to go through Super and just talk about the ripple effects that it creates. First and foremost, mechanically, keeping God Key temporary really does help the early parts of Dragon Ball Super breathe. And what I mean by that is certain concepts that were causing questions within the fanbase, things like Saiyan Beyond God, which is a little bit more vague in the manga, just wouldn't have a reason to exist. A transformation like Super Saiyan Blue, which suffers from being introduced right after Super Saiyan God, would have a whole lot more time to breathe and be its own distinct form. And to top it all off in a power scaling sense, characters like Vegeta, 17, and Frieza, who caught up to the level of a Super Saiyan God pretty much exclusively off screen in the manga, would have their own time to organically reach this level as well. It makes things better for everybody. Keeping God Ki temporary also gets rid of this situation that was going on in the manga where the story would constantly be prompting you to wonder if insert character here had caught up to or surpassed Beerus, only for it to not really matter in the future because Beerus was still stronger than everybody for insert reason here. In fact, creating a situation where Goku has to work towards the level of the gods even enhances the multiverse concept, as every person from another universe that he reaches will be an opportunity for him to become stronger with a clear goal in front of him that is not only just protecting the Earth and trying to fight this person, but also very personal in terms of him trying to prove something to himself. In fact, this decision would even enhance characters like Toppo and Jiren, whose entire characters revolve around them being compared to the gods of destruction. Goku meeting a person like Jiren who would be stated to be stronger than his god of destruction would be even more of a personal wall for him to climb because of this. And above all the plot related and mechanical benefits of keeping God Ki temporary, most importantly, keeping it temporary gives Toriyama and Toyotaro more time to decide what God Ki actually is in a power system sense. Obviously now in the manga we have forms like Ultra Instinct and Ultra Ego, which are techniques of the gods, which has helped to flesh out God Ki as a power system, but I think having more space in between Goku reaching the level of the gods, falling back down, and then having to climb his way back up really would make these things feel like something that's more earned to readers in general. So if you made it this far into the video, thank you so much for watching. I do videos like these all the time, so if you're a fan of Dragon Ball or Naruto or Boruto or pretty much anything else, definitely think about subscribing, but other than that, have a good day.